Thank you very much, Adrian, and good evening to everybody. And I would like to echo the sentiments about how brave and determined you all are. And also just a little update. Bruce is stuck in traffic and will be here hopefully within the next 30 minutes. But as you can see, we have a very generous amount of talent already on the podium. So without holding things up any further, what I'm going to do is first talk a little bit to Carlisle, and then move down the line, as it were, and then we will have a musical interlude at the end. And then if you would like to join us for nibbles, there will be nibbles at the end of this particular session. So just by way of introducing you, Carlisle, to the audience, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the fact that when you started out in life as a young man with ambitions, you actually wanted to be a painter, didn't you?
Yes, when I was very young, I wanted to be a painter, simply because one of the first things I did in the artistic realm, well, the very first was to draw, and which I started doing when I was about 4 or 5 there. And I also wanted to play the piano. And my mother, being a pianist, I imposed on her to teach me piano, and she got all the requisite piano instruction manuals and started me. And as soon as I realized there was work involved, that was the end of that. I subsequently took up piano seriously when I was 10 years old, but there was a hiatus there of about 7 years. So right from the beginning, I was interested in drawing, and continued to draw through high school. And then once I began becoming serious as a solo pianist and approaching that career, I gave up drawing and never have really gotten back to it. But I keep thinking in my old age, if you can believe what that may be, I would get back to it again, to doing some sketching.
You talked there about your studies of piano, which followed on from that original aspiration, perhaps to be a visual artist. And I was wondering whether you could say something about your childhood in terms of the music that you grew up with, because your father was a Methodist minister, and you grew up going to meetings of preachers, and there would have been a strong kind of musical element in those revival meetings, wouldn't there?
Very definitely. There were certainly hymns which were known specifically as revival hymns, certainly something that I think Tony would have found familiar as well. And of course, growing up in the small towns in the South, cultural life was pretty scarce to begin with. And really, so much of the music one heard was of a church variety. I mean, whether they be hymns or anthems or whatever. But that, plus the fact that my mother being a pianist, I heard a great deal of what were called semi-classics at the time, that kind of thing. So, or just kind of salon piano pieces. So it wasn't a life completely bereft of music. It just was a special kind of music. But certainly I heard a great deal of music for the church, for the Protestant church too.
And in fact, that's been a sort of theme throughout a lot of your work as an opera composer, hasn't it? I mean, your most well-known and most performed opera, Susanna, is on a biblical theme. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, Susanna is simply an updating of the apocryphal book of Susanna. And in my version, she is transferred to the Tennessee mountains. She's a very young, spirited young lady, 18 years old, who is erroneously convicted of being an evil and immoral girl because of being found bathing in the nude when the elders for the church are looking for a baptism creek. And the whole idea being because of the lust the elders feel towards Susanna, they then brand her as being the evil one. So it's a story of false condemnation, and also something that was very current in the period, because this was written during the McCarthy era in America, of accusation being tantamount to guilt. proof was not important. But
so did you write the opera in some sense as a kind of attack on McCarthyism?
Not consciously. I think unconsciously I did, because it was a very dark era in our history. And I was a very young professor at a state university in which we had to sign affidavits saying that we had never belonged to the Communist Party. And of course, none of us had ever had any idea during that, but just the fact that we had to do it made it all pretty onerous, and something that certainly gave you one indication of the temper of the times. And if you kept your job, you signed. If you didn't keep your job, I mean, if you didn't sign, you didn't keep your job, which is its own kind of fascism. So I lived through that period and seen people being accused of things that they had absolutely no idea of. And it was a very, very black period in our history. And so I think subconsciously that was all stored, so that when I began Susanna, I felt very, very passionate about these various themes that I did tackle in the opera, such as I said, just accusation being tantamount to guilt being certainly one of the chief one. But it was enough to launch my career as a composer of operas, and at a time in America when there were very few opera companies. When I began my career in the early 1950s, there were only 3 major companies that could have launched me as a composer, and that was the Metropolitan, which was an entirely European company, or the San Francisco, which was also European, and then the New York City Opera Company, which was an American company doing American works as well as standard works. And of course, that was my venue, was the now very much under a great deal of pressure to remain solvent of the City Opera. But it was a time, as I said, certainly the McCarthy era, when I began, because we're speaking now of 1955, 56, it was still very fresh in our minds and in our brains and in our personalities.
Now, when you decided to adapt Of Mice and Men in 1970, this was not your first attempt at literary adaptation. You had, in fact, done an adaptation of Wuthering Heights, which you have described as a fiasco. So what went wrong with Wuthering Heights? Yes, you have. I listened to you on public radio describing it as a fiasco.
Are you sure it wasn't my second opera, Fugitives?
No. But tell us about the literary adaptation of Wuthering Heights.
No, the reason I'm so startled is because I consider Wuthering Heights one of my best operas. My second opera was an opera that I did to a libretto of my own, which, to put it kindly, was absolutely a fiasco. And it was withdrawn immediately and has never been seen or heard of since. It now resides in the Library of Congress for anybody who's really interested. But I hope nobody is, because it's very bad. But that was the opera from which I learned the most, because the next opera I did was Susanna. But my second opera was Wuthering Heights, which was commissioned by the Santa Fe Opera, which was just in its second year of existence then. And one of the reasons that I did it was because everybody had this, you know, in our business and in most artistic businesses, you get labeled very easy, and I had been labeled as a result of Susanna, because Susanna contains hymns, it contains folk-like music, not actual folk music, but as a composer of Americana, which I wanted to avoid very much. So my publishers decided that it should be Wuthering Heights, which I protested vehemently at the beginning, because I thought this is just really, it's one of our great classics, and I didn't know that I was up to it. But nevertheless, when the commission came through, it specified that it was to be Wuthering Heights. And it's the only time in my entire career that I've had a subject matter which was specified for me in the commitment, because otherwise I'd make my own choice. But in retrospect, of course, I'm very, very glad I did it, because it's one of my favorite operas now of mine. So but I can't verify it as a fiasco, unfortunately.
I'll have to go back and look through my notes again. But I guess the benefit of the Bronte text is that you didn't have to deal with the estate. In the case of Steinbeck, you were actually in correspondence with him for some time through your agents, as far as I understand, but you never met, did you?
We never met. I mean, I assumed that we would meet, and I assumed that he assumed that we would meet. But he died suddenly of a heart attack in 1968, 2 years before Mice and Men had its premiere. But you're correct. My publishers worked through his agents, and then his message would come to me that way, and also my reaction back to him. And it was a very, very easy and comfortable working relationship. He never had anything to criticize remarkably about my libretto, except one thing, which I think is very, very important, and I was just discussing it in a previous interview I did. He wanted no reference to the 1930s, yeah, which I thought was very, very interesting. Yeah. And also told me that, he didn't tell me, but I just inferred from this, that what he felt was important in the book was not anything having to do with social issues and economic depravities of the time, but what I believe he intended was the concentration on the very simple theme of the fact that a flawed relationship, very incomplete relationship, such as it exists between George and Lennie, is preferable to the absolute solitary isolation of the ranch hands. And I think that's what he had in mind, and it was a marvelous way to dramatize that theme. And I came to know his widow, Elaine Steinbeck, very well, and she paid me the highest compliment of all. She said, "Your Of Mice and Men is what John thought was important in the novel." So for whatever that's worth, I hope that's the case.
Now, am I right in thinking, I have to check this with you first, that there was a revision to the original version that you did, because when you first wrote the opera, it was getting too long, and you decided you had to cut some things?
You have read all of my, I'm very impressed, very good. No, that's quite true. I made a fatal mistake. As most of us know, Of Mice and Men is a very slender novella of about 120 pages. And I think that I was seduced into thinking that Mr. Steinbeck had done my work for me. And so really all I did was to dramatize the book, which he had already done as a play, which was quite successful in New York. And I was not aware of this, however, until I had finished all of the libretto, this very misguided libretto, my first one, and also about 2/3 of the music, and it was getting to be the length of the Getterant Dameron, or something of Wagnerian length. And so I thought, this spare novel, this is the one thing I wanted to perpetuate in the operatic version, the leanness of the Steinbeck novella. And once it had gotten to this very inflated proportions, I was certainly not following that. So I realized that something was desperately wrong, which, as it happened, turned out to be the libretto, which it usually is with most unsuccessful operas. Not always, but very frequently. And so I simply went back, started all over again, and never again referred to the book, never looked at it again. But did what I think was my own Of Mice and Men at the urging of some stage director friends of mine that I trusted very much. And I think that was my salvation. I simply started over and said, what is this story about? And once I came up with what the through line of the story was, and it's basically a suspense story. It all comes down to one very simple statement. How long can George keep Lennie out of trouble so that they can acquire this very modest home they're looking for, and also then have the dream that dominates their lives of a place of their own. And it's as simple as that. It's under 25 words. But that gave me my lead in, and then everything that didn't feed directly into that through line, I simply eliminated. And so that's the way the present libretto stands. And then once I was on that footing, it went very quickly. And I knew that I felt that this is what I want to do with the piece from the very beginning.
I'm going to come back to you in a few moments, but
Okay.
I'd like to ask Andrea now to join the conversation. Andrea, when I've been sitting in on rehearsals, you have been beaming. Every day that you've been conducting these rehearsals, you've looked very happy, and it's been very clear from the beginning how much you love the score. And I was just wondering whether you could say something about what it is about the score that you love so much.
It's very difficult to pick up single elements, because probably the thing that passionates me the most in the piece is the whole piece. What I mean is that the organicity of the narration, the musical. By the way, one thing that I wanted to tell you, I read the book, the novella, about probably 10 years ago, so I was very confident with the story, of course. And by working on this score, it was probably the only time in my life that I had this experience, that I had exactly the same feelings in the narration, the way that the opera takes the emotion of the characters, the development of the story, the non-verbal quality of the piece brought me directly to the Steinbeck novella. So for me, the honesty in which the score is composed towards John Steinbeck's work is one of the experiences that made me develop what you called happiness in working to this in this production. Well, there are so many elements. It would be, I will later, with the help of our singers, I will pick up some examples. But as simple as may sound, is probably my answer is the whole of it. It's the way that the whole organism of this opera brings this story to the audience and to us as musicians.
How to make an entrance.
That was unbelievable.
The late Bruce Beresford.
It just took forever to get here.
It's all right.
A 15-minute trip took over an hour.
You were here.
Oh, God. Is there anyone there?
Lots of people there. Welcome, Bruce. I'll give you a few moments to collect yourself and settle down. We're just talking to Andrea about how he's been looking very happy during the rehearsals and how much he loves the score. So we've just been talking about what it is about the score. I guess the other thing that emerged in conversation with you, Andrea, was that you have a very strong commitment to works that have a very strong humanitarian message and theme. And so obviously this fits into that absolutely perfectly. So I was just wondering whether you could say something about the other kinds of works that you've done that fit into that kind of portfolio, if you like.
Well, there's probably a general statement which I'm working into for music theater and opera in general, especially the modern repertoire. So that, for example, we know that for in the traditional repertoire and older pieces, we have very, very often metaphoric stories that are told to tell something else. And I think that one of the most interesting elements, and also the duties, in my opinion, of modern theater, modern opera, is to address the story in a different way. I think the very first example was actually that strikes my mind is Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, which is a journalistic opera in a way. So, and the title of Mice and Men, the original title of Steinbeck, was Something That Happened. So it's a different way of achieving theatrical dramaturgy, which is, to me, is a major element of the modernity in theater, which is, by the way, kind of independent of which style of music or of narration you use. We were talking about Dead Man Walking, for example, as an operatic, one of the interesting operas the last years. So the way of opera to get into the nerve of modern reality, of social life, it's, to me, it's kind of a necessity. I love this word. I love the word necessity. And I worked with passion with composers that share this attitude. As myself as a composer, I work with this kind of stuff and with kind of dramaturgy, and I think it's important. It's important to get back to the middle of what a human condition is, not in a metaphoric way, but talking about from people to people. It's very simple what I'm saying. It may be superficial, but I hope is a beginning of explaining what is musical theater for me.
Can you say something, Andrea, too, about what you think makes this piece sound so American? Because to me, it conveys space in a way that composers like Copland also do. And is that a question of a particular style that Carlisle has? I mean, can you talk about his particular signature as an American composer?
This is, we were speaking about that just moments ago. And there's a number of elements. I have to say I have problems in answering this question because I always have problems putting things in a box. But it's true. It's true. It's pretty much evident and self-explanatory that the score we're working on is a very peculiarly American. Well, if you think about composers with like Bernstein or Samuel Barber or Aaron Copland, you find a line of probably. There's a combination of a harmonic language and a rhythmical language, which is probably the most clear element. But for example, a very interesting sentence of Carlisle just a few minutes ago, and it said that when for example we listen to Kurt Weill after he went to America for the Second World War issue, we hear American music, but composed by an European. We hear it. While there's something in the musical language which goes back to the roots when we listen to Aaron Copland, for example. Allow me to stop here because it's difficult. It's something non-verbal, actually. It's something that you perceive very clearly when you hear it. It's also the orchestration. It's also the certain harmonic combination, which I will try to highlight in some example later. Well. It is American. What it means being American is very difficult for me to pinpoint.
Tony, maybe you'd like to say something about that since you're singing the score. I mean, as an American, does it seem to you to resonate with some kind of deep sense of identity that you have musically?
Yes, very much so. I mean, as an American, the American dream is, to have your house and something of your own. And that, as Andrea was saying, this work speaks very deeply to me because it deals with the simplicity of what we all want and need, and that's just simple love. Something Lennie says, I just want something to call my own and to love. And so I have, I first sang this role in 1997, and was not sure I would get the part to begin with. I went into the audition for the Glimmerglass Opera, which is a little jewel of an opera house in upstate New York, in Cooperstown. And I went into the audition in New York City, and the day before I found out, and I said, I promise you, if you give me this role, I'll do my very best. And so it was, a dream come true because it was, I'm basically a really shy, introverted person, believe it or not. But Lennie and these outside characters that I've had the pleasure of playing, I'm not sure if it's a pleasure, but it's something that needs to be done. And I've done a lot of work with homeless and special needs kids and adults And so I wanted to give a voice to the voiceless, so to speak.
And do you see, I mean, your other great role for which you're so famous is, of course, Peter Grimes. Do you see any link between Peter Grimes and this role? In
Yes.
terms of these outsiders, these people who are sort of, yes, they're alienated, really, aren't they?
Well, they're alienated and they're very misunderstood. And as part of who I don't often refer to myself as an opera singer. I think to the general public that, gives you the idea that someone's a prima donna, a divo, difficult to work with. For me, singing and acting gave me an outlet. Growing up very shy, as Carlisle said earlier, I grew up in the church, had actually thought that I would become a minister. And so, his Susanna that we were talking about earlier, for my Metropolitan Opera audition as a young artist, I sang an aria, It Must Make the Good Lord Sad, from Susanna. And to this day, I know that in my heart of hearts, that's what got me into the Met Young Artist program. Because I was singing about something that was very close to my heart
Faith.
and that I knew. And I went on to sing Sam and Susanna at the Metropolitan Opera and Chicago Lyric Opera and Vancouver Opera and other places. So it was, I grew up very working class family. My parents didn't own a home. We rented until I started singing Of Mice and Men. And so I called my mother's house. The first thing I did was I bought my mother a little townhouse. And I call it the house that Lennie built, because I really believe that. And the being here. I mean, when I was a university student in North Carolina, a little small school, I had a poster up in my dorm room of the Sydney Opera House. So it was my dream to debut here, and then to sing Carlisle Floyd's music, and then to work with Bruce Beresford is a bit overwhelming. I mean, coming to rehearsal every day, and then, working with Andrea, I was, from the very get-go, I was extremely impressed with how well he knew the score and what a passion he has for, contemporary and American opera. And so that was, I would come to work and just sometimes get completely overwhelmed. And Lennie's a very challenging role. If you only had to act it, it would be exhausting. But then you put the music on top of that. It's overwhelming at that.
It's very intense.
Yeah.
Bruce, are you settled enough now for me to come to you? I guess I wanted to ask you. You've been really a champion of Carlisle's music for some time, and I was just wondering whether you could tell us when you first heard Carlisle's music and what made you kind of think, right, I want to direct this.
Well, it was about 15 years ago, I guess, when I had an opera agent in America then, and she said, "Do you know this composer Carlisle Floyd?" And I said, "Oh, well, I know some arias from various operas, and the only opera I'd heard right through was Susanna, which I thought was a masterpiece." And it was a great story. It was very melodic. It was beautifully orchestrated, and it was everything you love in opera. And I thought of Carlisle as sort of the American Benjamin Britten. I thought, well, he's just as great. And then she said to me, well, there's a new work being that they're going to do in Houston, and maybe you'd like to direct it. Oh, I nearly fell over. I said, oh, yes, I definitely would. She said, well, you can hear it on the piano. It hasn't been recorded yet. So I think I heard the piano. It's Cole Sassy Tree. It's a beautiful opera. Again, it's like all of his work in the sense, I mean, the operas are all different. I think I've heard about 5 or 6 of them now, including Wuthering Heights. And is it Jonathan Wade? Yes, it's wonderful. There's, and a couple I saw on DVD that I borrowed when I was there in Texas. They were all beautiful. They were all different, but they were all distinctively Carlisle's, but they weren't repetitive. And it was while I was there doing Susanna, doing Cold Sassy Tree, that I heard of Mice and Men. And I thought, oh, this is just a wonderful opera. I mean, everyone's been talking about the story, so elemental. Of course, the novella really, was a great favourite of mine. I think when I was in school, we read it when I was at school here in Australia. And I thought, gosh, that's a powerful story for an opera. It's got a tragic ending. Well, can't go past that. And it had wonderful characterizations. And I thought the adaptation, the libretto, Carlisle does all his own librettos, which is very rare among composers. I mean, Wagner did, but they're incomprehensible. Carlisle's aren't incomprehensible.
You're clearly not putting up your hand to direct The Ring. It's obvious.
I don't want to direct The Ring, no. Oh, there's some wonderful music, but I don't want to. I'd never be able to understand it. I'm a simple soul. So I said to Carlisle at the time, you know, listen, this would be a wonderful opera to do in Australia. None of your operas have been done there. And then when I came back here, I did Streetcar Named Desire, and then talked to Lyndon Terracini. I said, there's this wonderful American opera. Of course, he knew it. These guys, they know everything. And he said, you're right, it is a wonderful opera, we'll do it. So we went on from there.
John, when it comes to the design, you've designed a really beautiful barn for Act 2. Well, all the design's beautiful, but the barn is very striking, and it reminded me a little bit of the barn in Peter Weir's Witness. You've worked with Peter Weir, although not on that particular film. But when I asked you the other day about how you'd researched the look of the barn and of the haystack that's in Act 1, you came up with what I guess is now the ubiquitous answer to questions about research, and you just said the word Google. So
I couldn't live without it.
You tell us about how Google is the designer's best friend.
Yes. Well, if you're doing research these days, you don't have to go to a library. You just tap in American barns, and up come all these images, and you look at them and you distill ideas from them. And that's not the only way I designed the opera, but that was the beginning of the idea. And I saw one particular barn which had lots of slats with the light beaming through, and I thought, oh, that's the way I wanted to look. So I went on from there.
Tony, can I come back to you, because you've sung in so many productions of this opera, and I'm just wondering, can you tell us a little bit about the different ways that the opera's been staged and interpreted? Because I know that in the first week of rehearsals, there was quite a lot of conversation between you and Bruce about, you know, did you do this in Houston? No, we didn't do that in Houston. And one of the things that Bruce was absolutely adamant about, for example, is that in Act 1, we don't hear police sirens. So when the men are on the run, you, Bruce, were very clear that you didn't want us to have that sound and that sense of the police being out there. So can you tell us about some of the other productions that you've been in and how different they've been?
Well, when I come to a new production, I come with a very open mind. I mean, there was, in the beginning, as you said, a lot of reference to the Houston production and the recording, which was a live recording. It was not a studio recording. So I think it's very important as an artist to always keep an open mind. I think that that's always my goal, and not say, well, when I sang it in such and such production, that, you know, this is the way I do it, and it has to be done this way. You know, Andrea was great by pointing out some things that I was not doing right, and Bruce, and you need that, you know, and Bruce was, you know, very open and in helping me, you know, to continue to develop the character, because I never, you know, feel like I'm a finished product. I think when you know, I don't consider myself the definitive anything. As an artist, I think there's, you know, open discussion and different interpretations, and there are, you know, other singers singing the role of Lennie now, which I'm very happy and thrilled about. And I've gotten some phone calls from younger singers who said, now, what do I need to do here? And I said, the most important thing you need to do is go out and do some volunteer work, go observe, you know, some special needs adults, kids, because that's, you know, it was important for me not to become a caricature of someone that we think has special needs, because I didn't want it, I wanted it to be as realistic as possible. And Bruce and I had discussions in the rehearsal process about that. And
I wanted to bring you in here, Bruce, actually, about that, because that's a very personal subject to you, since you have a son with special needs. And I was just wondering whether you could say something about how Tony's characterization resonates for you as the father of someone.
Well, it did resonate right from the beginning, because, yes, I have a son who has Down syndrome. And I was amazed when the first few days of the rehearsal, how truthful Tony's portrayal of the character was. There were so many aspects of it that reminded me of my son, even the way he stood and the way he looked and the way he thought about things. And I said to Tony at one point, I find it uncanny how accurate you've got that. And then Tony told me that he'd actually worked with children with disabilities and observed them very closely. I mean, it was something that had always worried me about the opera, because I thought that role could be so easily caricatured, misunderstood. There's millions of things that could go wrong. But he does it with such, in a way, simplicity and fidelity to what these people are like. And also, it's marvellous the way he makes him likeable. Even though he murders a girl in it, it's... it was a great experience to do it. And all the other singers as well got a very fine cast. I mean, all of them, we've said, you know, try and keep it simple, absolutely truthful to the characters, you know, without any big operatic gestures and all that.
Well, is that partly because it is a piece of realism as literature?
Yes, that's
and
exactly
so
right.
I was wondering whether realism and opera are a natural fit, or whether there's a bit of a kind of tension and a battle going on there.
I think they fit, because I think the emotionalism of the music carries I mean, that's got such strength. And it's really underlying the characters that are on stage to such an extent that you don't have to, you know, it doesn't have to be with the big traditional operatic gestures. I think, in fact, probably the 5 or 6 or 7 operas or whatever it is I've directed, I've always tried to make the characters very believable and immediate. I mean, I did the same thing with Streetcar.
I'm aware of the fact that at least one of the singers tonight has to go and actually perform in Capriccio. So before we make you really nervous about the fact that you've got to leave, maybe, Andrea, you would like to introduce the singers and what they're going to perform for us.
Yeah, and I think it's appropriate. We don't want to bring him in problems, of course, and thank you very much for being available for that. I would, I wanted to pick up some example from the score, and I like to do it I like to highlight some hidden parts of the score, because the score is full of phenomenal, spectacular melodies and very theatrical moments, which are so self-explanatory and which are also so beautiful that I like to keep them for the performance. And I like to find a couple of little examples which can highlight the way Carlisle works theatrically with the musical elements, which struck my attention from the very beginning when I approached this score. And for example, one thing that I really think is masterful is how Carlisle works with the same materials in different moments of the piece, of the story, and how he changes just very, very little elements to highlight how this particular musical moment is used in the story. So, for example, just exactly the character of George. At the very beginning, George and Lennie are chased by the police. They eventually escape the police. And when they are safe, George says, he's completely frustrated and says, "You've done it again, we are in trouble, it's your fault, we lost our jobs." And then he eventually sings a line, a melody, which we learn just shortly later is a melody which is a kind of repetition in the relationship between Lennie and George. And the text says, "My life would be so simple by myself. I could live so easy all alone. No mess, no fuss, no trouble, none at all. Just me to take care of, I, me, and mine." And this is a melody which is kind of a signature of the relationship between Lennie and George, because this melody was sung probably in the past of their relationship so many times, because it's not the first time that Lennie and George get in trouble because Lennie is so unable to stay out of trouble, actually. So this is the first time we hear this melody.
So simple by myself, I could live so easy all alone. No mess, no fuss, no trouble, not at all. Just me to take care of, I, me, and mine. Without you, I could live where I pleased. Without you, I could save my pay. Without you, I could settle down and maybe lead a decent life, with no one but me to take care of. No one else to look after, a life free of trouble, a life all alone. But no, I gotta travel with you. Hold your hand and wipe your nose and God knows what. And no matter how hard I try, I can't keep you out of trouble. So why do I stay? Why? When my life would be so simple by myself, I could live so easy, all alone. No fuss, no mess, no trouble, none at all. Just me to take care of, and no one else. Just me to take care of, me and only me, I, me and mine.
Now we have the same melody much later, at the end of the piece, when actually Lennie has already killed the lady, the Carlisle's wife, and he knows, he somehow knows that he's done something really bad this time. And eventually George finds him, and George, at this time, has already decided that he will be the one that he will kill Lennie, because otherwise the people from Curly will kill him. And he decided that he will be the one to do it, because he wants Lennie to die happy. And this is, of course, from the human point of view, probably the most tragic situation you can imagine yourself. So George finds Lennie eventually, and Lennie says, I might have lost our jobs again. I might have lost our jobs again. And then try to do something that sometimes children do, like just shout at me, just give me hell, and then maybe everything will be fine again. So, aren't you gonna give me hell, George? Come on, George, give me hell. And George, to try to calm Lennie down, sings this melody again, but Carlisle puts some little pauses in between the notes, so that it's very clear that the human attitude with which George sings this melody is completely different. He's not frustrated or angry as it was before, he's desperate now. And he makes some stops. He doesn't want to go on. It's difficult for him to sing. And then Lennie says to him, come on, George, come on, you know the story, you know the melody, keep it singing and make it to end for him. So I like also to have this second appearance of this melody in this completely new situation. The melody is the same, but please note how the theatrical composition is different.
Myself, I could live so easy all alone.
Come on, George, you know, no mess, no fuss, no trouble, no, just me to take care of me and mine.
That's enough.
And also the melody started slower. The first appearance is faster, the second is slower, and then Lennie brings it to the original tempo. This is for me a fantastic way of using musical materials to describe the development story. A very similar example is with another melody, and I take it again from the first act, is the melody where George describes to Lennie the house that they want to achieve, that they want to buy. And this is, again, is a song, is a melody that was sung so many times in the relationship of John and Lennie. It's like probably every night when they go to bed, George sings this melody to Lennie and to describe how beautiful the house will be that we'll eventually buy. Later, back to the end, when George has achieved to calm down Lennie and is now deciding how to do it, Lennie asks him, yeah, tell me about the house again. And George does it, knowing that he's going to kill him in a few minutes. The melody is exactly the same, but listen to the piano.
One day soon we'll have us a farm with its small white frame house and 2 acres of land. And we'll have us a barn with some livestock inside and a garden and also a clover field.
Now, Mrs. Golla is a fantastic pianist. She didn't make mistakes. Can you play the first chord, the first chord in number 104? So in the original melody, in the original orchestration of the melody, was just strings, by the way, were consonants chord, very delicate, very plain. And now you have a harp and 2 bassoons making a very low dissonance. Can you play it isolated? And by the way, Carlisle chose bassoons in that region where they cannot play too soft. So that you have to hear that, and it hurts. It hurts very subtly, but it does. And this is the way that just with non-verbal and very, very delicate elements, the complete difference attitude of the singing of George is highlighted in the score. Thank you.
I know that we're going to have another little musical interlude with Jack Mabardi in a moment, but before we do, it just strikes me that with Bruce and John here, we should talk just for a moment about the influence of movies on this production, because certainly in the rehearsal room, you've talked, Bruce, quite a lot about the 1939 movie and how much you liked it and how you felt that it was a very true adaptation of the novel, and that you used it in some respects as a reference point for the production, just on little details like things about the way they carried their bedrolls and various other kind of details. And I was just wondering whether you and John might like to say something about the films in relation to your production.
You mean something you haven't just said? Well, the 1938 or 39 film, which is directed by Louis Milestone, who directed All Quiet on the Western Front, the original one, is, I think, an extremely fine bit of filmmaking. And, of course, it had the advantage, you see, of being made in California only a couple of years after the novel was written. And so we did look at it to help us with the costumes and details of the dressing in the bunkhouse, and yes, the bedrolls that they slept in. I got the people here at Opera Australia, the props people, to copy them, more or less, so that we knew what was in them. There was a blanket, there was cups and things like that. Because I thought, well, if the film was made at that time by a very, very distinguished director, I'm sure he got it right. And it did help a lot with the authenticity, because although I think I spent a lot of my childhood on a farm near Kulo, run by my uncle, and I used to watch the shearers come every year to shear the sheep, and they lived in a place that was very like what we have in this, and that helped me a lot too. But that combined with the movie helped to realise the whole thing, I think, the details. Anything else?
Yeah, John, I mean, how different is designing an opera production from designing a movie, apart from the fact that there are far more scenes that you have to cover in a film than you do on an opera stage?
Well, with a movie, of course, you're dealing with absolute realism. On the operatic stage, it's a sort of heightened realism. It's not entirely true to life, but films are so different. The technique is different. The timing is different. I think I basically prefer to work on the stage.
Yes, well, there are lots of...
But working with Bruce always insists on realism, so I have to...
You sound critical.
No, I just... I have to sneak in a few unrealistic elements.
Before we come back to the next moment of music and also the opportunity for you to ask questions from the audience, I just wanted to come back to you, Carlisle, and ask you about whether movies were very influential in your work as a composer and librettist, because I read an interview, and again, I need to check with you that this is right, in which you said that you wanted to make sure that the opera moved along at a real clip and that there was sort of no dead moments, and that you wanted it to have the pace of a film. So were you quite influenced by the sort of cinematic language while you were working as a composer?
Well, I think I was influenced by cinematic language growing up. I think almost everybody in America, and probably Australia at the same time, in the 30s and the 40s, films were our art form. I mean, and if you saw serious music being represented, it was usually represented in a film of some kind. I mean, although you may have had the good fortune to hear a pianist in person, but you were more likely to have seen that pianist or a pianist in a film. But so I grew up very, very much in the film tradition, and I consider that that was very much a part of my whole adaptation towards writing for the stage.
But were you ever, I'm not aware of whether you've written any scores for movies, have you?
No, I've never have.
Would you like to have done that?
I always wanted to try that, yes. I think it's a different discipline. I'm quite aware of that, but I would like to see whether I can master it or not.
Oh, well, why not try now? I also wanted to ask you, just to finish up, about the fact that you've obviously seen, I think, 20 productions of Mice and Men, and or more. Maybe you've seen more than 20. But the other night you were saying to me that in one particular production we've had ongoing problems with the dog in the cast. The dog, well, you'll see. But anyway, and the other day Carlisle said that in one particular production the dog just plain walked off the stage in the middle of the scene, didn't come back, and a singer had to go off stage, pick him up, carry him back on. So have you seen anything particularly unusual or remarkable in terms of the numbers of productions of your opera that you've seen where you've kind of raised an eyebrow and thought, not too sure about that?
No, I can't really say that I have. Now, I was saying earlier to Andrea, I mean, I've seen 2 productions of Mice and Men in Europe. The most recent being in 2001 in the Bregenz Festival, with a beautiful production by Francesca Zambello, which was subsequently done in Washington and in Houston, as well as the Bregenz Festival. That it was different, but it was the same, and she frequently, as a director, can go into rather extreme directorial alleys that I don't necessarily follow on. However, in the case of Mice and Men, it was very, very true, I thought, to the novel and also to the opera, and it was a very successful production. I saw a production in France of Mice and Men, and I was afraid it was going to be, you know, what is commonly called these days Eurotrash, which I don't mean in a derogatory sense, but perhaps I do. At least when I think of some operas of mine in Europe that I hardly recognized, then I suppose that applies. But I think I think any good director, if they get hold of the opera, and if they read the libretto, I think there's a simplicity and a spareness and about it. I don't think they can go too far wrong if they observe basically what's in the libretto, and also, more importantly, what's indicated by the music. Because I think it's all there. I hope it is. And I think then to take the story beyond its limits would be, I think it would be dangerous territory for a director. So I've been very fortunate in that. I can't say the same for my opera of Susanna. I've seen some absolute travesties of that, but mostly in Europe, I will have to say. But and with the so-called directors' theater, that is now very much the fashion in Europe, especially in Germany, in which the directors use the opera as the point of departure. And I can't say that ever makes me very happy. I saw a production of Susanna, as a matter of fact, in which in the opening scene of the second act, in which Susanna and her brother Sam are discussing whether she will go to a revival meeting or not, on stage wandered a character dressed as Elvis Presley. And my first reaction was, oh my God, this guy has come to the wrong theater. Except he had a can of beer, swilling it, and he sat down on the front porch in a rocker while the dialogue went on. You understand, he was completely unacknowledged by Sam or Susanna. He was just there. And so at the end of the scene, he walks off with Sam, and there's never any explanation of what he's doing on the porch in East Tennessee. I mean, it's I subsequently spent an evening with the cast trying to find out. I was playing, what did this mean? What did that mean? And they would explain to me. And that was supposed to be a comment on American pop culture of the 1950s. And of course, my obvious question was, how does the audience know that? Because my publishers were there, and I remember a phone conversation after I got back to my hotel. We went through various things that we didn't know what they meant. And I said, what about Elvis Presley? What was he doing in there? And she says, I have not the slightest idea. And so that's as close as we got to it. That kind of thing, I think, is needless and is also, I think, damaging to a work. I can't think of anything, any production of Mice and Men that has suffered the same fate, thank goodness.
For that.
And I'm very grateful for that. And certainly Bruce is wonderfully faithful.
Maestro, would you like to lead us into the next and final musical moment?
Yes. I chose one of the topical moments of Curly's wife, still in the first act, when she comes into the bunkhouse where she's not supposed to come, and she sings her frustration towards her husband. She's married. Actually, it's just 2 weeks or 2 months at the very end, because it's there's two versions. The first version says that they are married for 2 weeks, and then in the second version of the libretto she says 2 months, which is probably more credible, I imagine.
I think so,
probably. Anyway, she's already completely frustrated. In the next scene, when she's going to be killed by accident by Lennie, she wants to leave. She wants to leave to go for Hollywood because she's a very pretty girl. And she sings this frustration in front of the bunk of the ranch hands and all the people. And what fascinated me is that the complexity of the melodic line is very difficult, very it is a melodic line which it's very difficult to be realized in a sexy way, in a smooth way, and Jacqueline does it in a fantastic way. So it's also a tribute for me to her way of approaching this role. And the other thing is, coming back to the same approach that I had with the other fragments, is that pay attention to one melody which is sung 2 times in this aria, and when she says, I'm beginning to feel neglected. And she does it 2 times. The first time is faster than the second. And this is another example how Carlisle uses slight difference in using the same music material to highlight the development of how the character feels throughout the narration. Please.
He's always left when I've just come. He's always been where I'm just at. I'm beginning to feel neglected. It's not at all what I had expected, and me
We've got a few moments left, so please, if you've got a question for this very distinguished panel, put your hand up and we'll come to you.
Mr. Floyd, you said earlier that you were aware of the loneliness of the ranch hands, and as we've seen the other characters in this production. Do you feel that you've been able to convey that, especially in this production, as well as as a subtext to the George and Lennie?
I think it's pretty evident that these are men whose lives are constantly on the move. We were talking about bedrolls a while ago. I mean, that's their way of moving from one place of labor to the next. And they have everything they own usually rolled up in the bedrolls. But while I don't specifically single out their loneliness, I think it's very evident at the end of Act 1 when they all sing Moving On. And each man really into himself. Talking about the loneliness of their life, and this is their, basically without saying so, this is their fate as human beings, to live lives of no connections in either human or in terms of where they live. But it's all a question of moving on, which it becomes also, as Andrea might have pointed out to you, it becomes a theme for much of the music you hear after it's first announced at the end of Act 1. You hear variations on this theme of moving on throughout the rest of the opera. But I hope it's implicit. I hope it's explicit too.
Mr. Floyd mentioned bad opera. It may be a naive question, but what makes a bad opera or a good opera?
In 25 words or less. I think, and I've talked this over with colleagues of mine, to me, a successful opera is at least dependent 60% on the libretto, and possibly even more. I think there are more operas in the operatic graveyard that died because of a very poor libretto, because composers are not necessarily the best choosers of material. And they may write quite professional scores that have a lot of merit, but I think the thing that absolutely guarantees or condemns an opera to extinction are poor librettos. And you say, well, what makes a poor libretto? A libretto that doesn't basically honor the two basic ingredients for opera is passion or very intense emotion, and also action. The one thing that you avoid like the plague, I mean, if you want to create a successful opera, is any kind of just intellectual discussion. Because it's, first of all, it's sung. So you have the elongation of words through music, and there is certainly no emotion or action, either one, implied in an intellectual discussion, unless it is part of something else again. So I think what I always look for in a libretto, and as a matter of fact, right now, I'm considering 2 libretto projects, both of which have these elements. The first thing I look for is a crisis situation. Opera is not just any day. It's the exact day. I mean, look at the end of the first act of Tosca, that collision of Tosca and Scarpia there. That's not just any day. It's the day he came and looking for her. And this could go on ad infinitum in a role that Tony is very famous for now, Peter Grimes. The entrance of Grimes into the hut during the storm. That's not just any night, it's the night of the storm. So it has, in other words, it has very highly dramatic natural elements that feed into it. And I've often said, using that as an example, just imagine his appearing in the door without the storm behind him. And you lose, I would say, what, 50% of the dramatic effect. So these are just some of the things that one has to consider. It's a very, very severe discipline, I find, of doing a correct libretto. I mean, not correct, but one that's going to work. And I think that's the first and certainly the biggest major hurdle that a composer is confronted with in writing an opera. But I really meant that, and something that Caroline said earlier. I was once doing an interview for the New York Times, and I simply said, in connection with this, I don't want the audience to ever have a chance to blink. This comes, I think, from my going to the movies. And I said, I think the modern audience expects to nod off during an opera. I remember when my opera Willie Stark was done at the Kennedy Center, and I was sitting next to the head of the Congressional Committee on the Arts, who was a very, very wonderful gentleman from Illinois, and he paid me a supreme compliment afterwards. He said, Mr. Floyd, I flew out to Illinois today to see my constituents and flew back tonight. And I thought, well, I'm going to the opera. Oh, great. I'll have a chance to doze. And he says, I have to tell you, I never dozed once during the entire opera. I consider that the ultimate compliment. So.
I wanted to ask Anthony a question, and I've seen you in Peter Grimes, and I can imagine, which I will be seeing you shortly in this opera. Does it get to be kind of sad singing because you're famous for these roles, singing these really enormously sad roles very often? I mean, other opera singers get the chance to do a bit of comedy, or they're not entirely about, in both these cases, men whose whole life is a tragedy, even before it goes wrong in the opera. Both Lennie and Peter Grimes are this sort of very sad person. Is it sad doing that? Do you kind of debrief yourself at the end, or?
I do try to debrief myself at the end, but
yeah.
I think my feelings are that you're born and have a mission in life. The roles I sing are quite lonely roles, and what Carlisle said earlier, and there is loneliness associated with doing these roles. And there's also typecasting that's done, especially, I'm a man of stature, as if you didn't know that or not. I try to take care of myself emotionally and physically, and sometimes I go home and just watch cartoons or watch, Real Housewives of Beverly Hills or something to kind of, to unwind. But yes, but it is difficult, but it's part of, I feel, is my mission on this earth, and it's to put a voice to the voiceless. I mean, there was one day I was coming to work here, and I saw a homeless man with no shoes, and I've done a lot of work with homeless people, and have done work with mental health patients. My father, who recently passed away, suffered from schizophrenia. So I know these characters. I know the isolation. I also know what it's like, to be a son, a brother, to people that suffer from these illnesses, and it takes a lot out of you. But I'm a man of great strength, and I take things in stride. And it is hurtful, when people can't look beyond my size sometimes, or other, but it's the way society views us sometimes. So it's a blessing in many ways that I get to perform these roles and hopefully give them a real life interpretation.
Thank you.
Unless there's another question, since that was such a beautiful and such a moving and candid answer, that might be a great place to stop and in fact say that now we'd love you to join us for a nibble and a drink. But before we do that, please will you thank my very distinguished guests this evening. Thank you. And if any of you would like to join the book club on Monday night, the inaugural opera, not Oprah, book club, 6:30, we'll be here, Bruce and novelist Malcolm Knox and Professor Paul Giles from the US Studies Centre at Sydney University, and I think it'll be a really interesting conversation. Thank you all very much for coming tonight.
I see it,